I'm trying to understand the very nature of electromagnetism and light, and because I think they're so closely related to consciousness, as we discussed earlier, I think they're the interface with consciousness.
Where do you, and I realize you'd probably be speculating here, but let's demarcate this as speculation. Where do you think the consensus is possibly off on our conventional understanding of electromagnetism or light?
Well, I think the consensus is off on virtually the whole of physics insofar as it ignores consciousness totally. You know, if you look at physics textbooks or physics, there's nothing whatever about consciousness there. And sometimes you can ask an intelligent physicist, you know, why isn't there? He said, well, physics isn't about consciousness, it's about physical things. You know,
Right.
Psychologists and maybe biologists study consciousness. We don't, it's not our area. But that's true, and it's a reasonable response. But the thing is that biologists in mechanistic biology, the dominant kind, say that what we want to do is reduce all life and mind to chemistry, molecular biology, and then to physics. And once we've reduced it to physics, we've explained it. And since there's no consciousness in physics, then they think there can't be any anywhere else either.
Right.
And so we've got this ridiculous situation where physicists don't have consciousness in it because they're not studying consciousness. Then everyone else thinks physics is the foundation of the whole of science. And if it's not in physics, it can't exist.
Right.
Then you get the hard problem. You know, it ought not to exist at all.
Yeah, it's weird because it all came from Descartes, but really Descartes is saying consciousness is all that exists or something, but it came from it turns into this radical doubt of your own kind of epistemological view or something, and you're just a brain in a vat, and, you know, is radical skepticism applied to everything, when in fact it's really all you can presuppose is consciousness or take a priori as consciousness.
Well, what Descartes did was just split the world into consciousness, which is God, angels, and human minds, and matter, or nature, which is unconscious and follows mechanical laws. And so from the 17th and the 18th century, most people went along with that, and it meant that it divided the realm of science and religion. So you could still have religion about God, angels, morality, human minds, etc. And science could go on looking at nature and ignoring consciousness. But then in the 19th century, with the rise of materialism and atheism and materialism are more or less the same thing, because materialism says there's only unconscious matter in the universe. Then God and angels were just sort of rubbed out, just eliminate God and angels. Then all that's left of consciousness is the human mind, and then that has then to become the matter of the brain.
Yeah.
So Descartes actually had God and angels and the whole realm of consciousness, but he said it's not in space and time, it's supernatural, and it's not extended in space. And so the mind is outside space and time, and so is consciousness.
So let's go back to the Faraday. Where do you think the consensus is off on light and electromagnetism? And I realize you'd be sort of speculating here, but if you were to just take a guess.
Well, I don't think it's exactly off. I think it's there's something about electromagnetism and light which are related to consciousness. And as you mentioned earlier, John Joe McFadden thinks that the fields of our brains, the electromagnetic fields of our brains, are the basis of our consciousness. That he thinks electromagnetism is consciousness. I don't go that far. I don't agree with that. I think it's the interface. I think there's sort of quantum processes, electromagnetic processes, and morphic fields and mind and consciousness here. Electromagnetism's the bridge between them. And you see, Faraday was not a materialist. Faraday believed that the ultimate reality in the universe is force, that the whole of fields of force, the whole of space is filled with fields of force. And he thought matter arose from these fields by being sort of concentrated fields in particular points or places. But fields were primary for Faraday. And he thought of magnetic fields as having lines of force. And he thought the lines of force were like tubes through which the ether flowed or some fluid flowed. So did Maxwell in his original equations of electromagnetism, treated the fields of force, the lines of force, as like tubes with a spiraling vortex of activity. Well, Faraday thought the lines of force were physical, that you see them when you scatter iron filings around a magnet. You actually see lines. And if you want to compute magnetic field intensity, it's the number of lines going through a particular area, the number of lines of force. If you look in a modern textbook, it has the lines of force, and it has the field intensity based on the number of lines of force. But then it says, after it's described and explained everything in terms of these lines of force, it says, but these lines of force are, of course, only imaginary and are a convenience for thinking about this.
Right.
So they use them. Their whole theory depends on, they say, well, they don't really exist. And yet, Faraday was convinced they do exist, that they're the physical basis of these phenomena. So I'm trying to understand, how magnetism and electricity are related. He thought it was the ether and flows of fluid. What are lines of force? What is it that's flowing through these lines of force? And if it's flowing, which direction is it flowing in? From the future to the past, or from the past to the future, or both? Because I think light, you see, Maxwell's equations for light, which were influenced by Faraday's thinking, show that light, the equations work equally well if, when I see you, the light moves from you to me, or whether something moves from me to you. The equations work. That was the basis of the transactional theory. Richard Feynman, in 1945, wrote a key paper with Wheeler, who was a key figure in astronomy and gravitational theory. And they dealt with this, the roots of the transactional interpretation, the bidirectionality from future to past and past to future. And in the famous Feynman diagrams, you have lines of particles interacting. A line, you can have lines going backwards in time. A positron, according to Feynman, a positively charged electron, is an electron going backwards in time. So Feynman's thinking was shot through with this, that it can go both ways in time. And I think that the light and electromagnetism have this quality. And I think the bit that goes from future to past is probably related to consciousness, because of this reverse causal flow of consciousness. And that is somehow the interface with consciousness. So if you look in a modern physics textbook, within sort of two lines, you're into a kind of wall of equations, which create a kind of fog, which stops you thinking about it. Because if you can't follow the equations, you think, oh, I'll just leave this to physicists, thinking about magnetism or matter or something. But I'm trying to think about it without the fog of equations and see what's actually really going on. And Faraday was not approaching this mathematically. He didn't know any maths. He was approaching it as phenomena that actually interact. How does light interact with magnetism? He did experiments, and he found that magnetic fields change the polarization of light, and that tells you that light is magnetic or has a magnetic aspect. And he discovered that empirically by looking at what changed it.
Do you think we need to resuscitate the ether, or that space is in fact empty or full? This is obviously a debate between Bergson and Einstein, and you have the Michelson-Morley experiments of the 1890s, where they did a set of these sort of optical detections, and they're like, we're not detecting the ether. But I've always thought, the absence of evidence is not the evidence of absence, and people like Feynman later, you could boil all of the world's oceans, with just a single cup of coffee, and so maybe there is actually a lot of energy in empty space.
Well, that's the standard view in quantum theory. The so-called zero-point field or quantum vacuum field is supposed to be full of energy, and virtual particles pop out of it and go back into it all the time. And I mean, that's part of quantum electrodynamics, which Feynman was, an expert in. And quantum electrodynamics is often said to be the most accurate theory that's ever been devised.
I agree with you, but general relativity would, and there's even actually a paper, I think in 1923, where Einstein says general relativity is in fact compatible with the ether. So he sort of goes back on, his special relativity denied it, and then.
Well, it depends what you mean by it, you see, because the thing is that different people, is the quantum vacuum field the ether? Is the Higgs field, of which Higgs bosons couple to the ether, which is separate from the quantum vacuum field? Is there a fluid flowing through magnetic lines of force, the ether, as Maxwell thought? You see, the particular theory that the Michels-Morley experiment was about was a theory that there's a uniform ether spread out equally through space and time,
right,
like a framework for the whole of the universe, and that if the Earth's moving in one direction relative to another, it should affect the light and so forth. That was a particular theory of the ether as the carrier of light, uniformly distributed. But you see, these other theories of the ether are completely different theories and aren't refuted by Michels-Morley. And I'm not sure how helpful they are, or, something's going on. Whether it helps to call it the ether, I don't know.
Right. Maybe it's more of a field variable, or you can have vacuum polarization or something. But I want to get to two topics before we end here. One is your son, Merlin Sheldrake, has written a fantastic book about fungi and fungal intelligence. It's called Entangled Life. And do you look at that at all? Are you interested in that at all?
Oh, certainly I am, yes. I mean, I think it's an amazing book because he weaves together so many different philosophical ideas, history of science, field ecology, modern electrophysiology and so forth.